All right, everybody, we are live on the YouTubes. Stelman Smith Jr. here for the Unapologetic Apologists, and I can't tell you how excited I am for today's episode. Josh Rasmussen has been on the show several times. He's a good friend of mine, and for the first time, welcoming to the show, Dr. William Lane Craig. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about God, Overall, Divine Aseity, and the Challenge of Platonism. I received that book a couple years ago for my birthday. My family all pitched in and got it for me. And I guess without taking too much time for introductions, I do want to bring up here the YouTube channels, Dr. Craig Videos, that is obviously Dr. Craig, and Josh Rasmussen's YouTube channel is Worldview Design. But I guess to start, Dr. Craig, if you wouldn't mind telling us what got you interested in studying the topic of Platonism and Divine Aseity.
The project is the third installment of a long-range research program that I've been engaged in since finishing my doctoral studies. I am working on, in philosophy of religion, is called the coherence of theism, which is a philosophical analysis of the principal attributes of God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, necessity, and so on. And so in the past, I have tackled and written on divine omniscience, and then on divine eternity. And this third installment is on divine aseity, which is God's property of self-existence. And what motivated this study was that in 1982, I attended a meeting of the Society of Christian Philosophers in Milwaukee, where I heard Thomas Morris, then a philosopher at the University of Notre Dame, give a paper called Absolute Creation, in which he laid out in a very powerful way the challenge that Platonism poses to divine aseity. On Platonism, there are these eternal, necessary, uncreated objects. Indeed, there are infinities of infinities of infinities of them. And this means that God is not the sole ultimate reality, to borrow Brian Leftow's phrase. Rather, God is just one uncreated being among many. And Morris tried to give an answer to Platonism, but it was so painfully obvious that his solution didn't work, that it was in fact viciously circular. And so for many years, it was an issue that just was on the back burner for me. I didn't have an answer to it. And having completed my study of divine eternity, I finally decided to take up this subject of divine aseity. And that was what prompted then this study of the challenge posed by Platonism to the doctrine of God as the sole ultimate reality and the creator of everything that exists other than himself.
Yeah, so I know you say in the book, and I actually have an overlay here I can bring up that lays out some of the options, that you thought when you started your study that you would be defending divine conceptualism. And so obviously the kind of dialogue here, it's not really a debate, it'll be more of kind of dialogue between realism, the arguments for and against, and then anti-realism, the arguments for and against. But what would you say was maybe the thing that started changing your mind as you studied from taking a realist approach to more of a non-realist approach?
In approaching this topic, I had a vague understanding that the mainstream position in the history of Christian doctrine from Origen and Augustine on up through the Middle Ages was a sort of divine conceptualism. The church fathers and medievals took the realm of Platonic ideas that for Plato existed independently and separately, and they moved it into the divine mind as the ideas of God. They were thoughts of God. And so there really isn't an abstract object, say, like the number two. Rather, it is a thought in the mind of God. And I thought initially, well, this would probably be the position I would defend. But as I studied the literature on Platonism and its alternatives, I became aware of a whole cornucopia of anti-realist views on the subject, many of which struck me as very plausible and persuasive. And so it seemed to me that the conceptualist was conceding too quickly to realism, and that therefore we need to explore more thoroughly anti-realist alternatives as well as realist alternatives to Platonism. So there are two kinds of anti-Platonism on offer today. There are realist versions of anti-Platonism, like conceptualism, which would take putative abstract objects like mathematical objects to in fact be concrete objects, things like thoughts in the mind of God. Those would be realist anti-Platonisms. But then there would be this whole potpourri of anti-realist Platonist views to be explored as well.
Great. And so I guess before we get into maybe the arguments for and against divine conceptualism, Josh, I would like to bring you in here and ask you where it is you agree with Craig, what you see the challenge of Platonism to be and how you go about solving that problem.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm very interested in thinking about like which model of God and properties can sort of fit together, if any. And one of the things I appreciate about what you've done, Craig, in your book is that you survey a lot of different models and you consider, okay, is there any model on the realist side that could be defensible? And actually, there was one model that you said could be defensible, but you didn't know anybody who held that model. And it turns out that I've come to a version of that model. So we'll be able to discuss. I think you might be pleased with my progression of thought. When I was at Notre Dame, I was a Platonist. I didn't see sort of any problem with Platonism. And for me, what began to knock my view over was a series of philosophical considerations. First, I thought about this puzzle of propositions, which actually goes back to Bertrand Russell. It's related to his set paradox, except we apply it to propositions. And there are worries about if you have all the propositions just necessarily existing, automatically existing, you get self-reference problems. For example, take the proposition that all the propositions exist. Well, that proposition includes itself. So this gives you self-referring propositions. But then if you can have self-referring ones, then you can talk about the proposition about all the non-self-referring ones. And then that one turns out to be self-referring if and only if it isn't, which is a contradiction. And I've pondered that puzzle. I pondered solutions to it. And so about, I would say maybe a couple of years ago, I began to develop a kind of modified Platonism, and where you have some basic ungrounded abstracta propositions, and then you can generate other propositions through mental reflection on the basic ones. But I've actually been moved away even from that. And actually in preparing for our discussion, I was thinking about presenting two different realist models just for consideration. But in the end, I really only have one realist model. So I think I'm going to end up joining Craig in being skeptical of the Platonism. The other thing that kind of moved me off of it was even this sort of modified Platonism, which is thinking about sort of what unifies the abstract landscape. So thinking about this from a theistic perspective, God has a bunch of, let's just assume for sake of argument, a realist view of properties. God has properties, and yet it seems like they're all positive. It's got power, knowledge, goodness. Why are they all positive? It seems like there's got to be maybe a deeper explanation of that. Maybe there's a kind of perfection that's the root of his other positive properties. And so this got me thinking that it would be nicer, just for theoretical reasons, to have a unified view of the world where you minimize the number of ungrounded entities as much as you can. And I didn't know if you could completely minimize it on realism, but I have a view now that I think can do the trick. It doesn't require conceptualism, so we'll get to that. But so at this point, I think that I'm sort of tentatively giving up Platonism. So this is a major transition in my thinking, and it's happened slowly over about 10 years.
Wow.
And my reasons are philosophical, but then they do sort of join the theological consideration, because if I'm right, then there's only one thing that's independent, just one thing, and that would be God. So I think that you might appreciate this result.
Yeah, if I could comment on that, it's interesting for our listeners to understand that Josh's skepticism about Platonism is, as he says, rooted in philosophical considerations, whereas mine are entirely theological. For me, it is a theological non-negotiable that God is the creator of everything else that exists other than himself. In the book, I do a fairly detailed exegesis of the prologue to the Gospel of John, which begins with the words, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made, not one thing." So it seems to me that this is the theological hill that I'm prepared to die on. Is I'm committed to the existence of God as the sole uncreated reality. And that's my primary reason for rejecting Platonism. Now, therefore, philosophically, I am very, very open to any sort of anti-Platonist view, whether realist or anti-realist, and very eager to explore these options.
Yeah, great. So it's funny. So months ago, when Josh and I were initially talking about this, I think you might have mentioned to me that you would defend divine conceptualism, but it sounds like you've moved from that. So I guess rather than asking you, Dr. Craig, what your criticisms of divine conceptualism specifically are, I might ask you, do you have any criticisms or critiques of, say, realist positions in general?
Oh, I think they're so different that there wouldn't be a sort of general criticism that I would be aware of. Maybe there are, but I've not thought of it. In the book, I examine conceptualism and also psychologism to a degree. Psychologism would identify putative abstract objects as thoughts in human minds. And that just seems obviously unacceptable. And so the better alternative is conceptualism, which would say abstract objects are thoughts in a divine mind, an infinite, omniscient mind. Then there are also formalist views of mathematical objects that would see them as being either just marks on paper or physical structures that can be manipulated, and those are very different. And so I think the objections to these different views would be quite different.
Okay, so maybe then fix my question a bit. What would you see as the strength in an anti-realism position, such as neutralism, or the one that I found most preferable to me, which was pretense theory?
Yes. Well, at the root of modern Platonism is this criterion of ontological commitment emanating from the Harvard philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine. And on this criterion of ontological commitment, we are committed to the reality of the reference of any singular terms and also the values of any variables that are bound by the first order existential quantifier, like there is or there are, in sentences that we take to be true. So if I say something like this, that there are features that spiders and insects share, that would commit me ontologically to the reality of features. And those look like properties, so supposedly I'm committed to the reality of properties by affirming that there are features that insects and spiders share. And to me, this was just a terrible example of trying to read metaphysics off language, of reifying words and terms into actual realities. It seemed to me to be terribly ontologically inflationary, is the way I would put it. And so as I read on this subject, I just became very, very skeptical about the truth of this criterion of ontological commitment, it seems to me that we can use or assert true sentences that have singular terms in them and existential quantification that don't refer to anything or imply the reality of anything. And so that I think is the strength of a view like neutralism. Neutralism says that existential quantification, like there are or there is ontologically neutral, and that singular terms don't necessarily have real world reference corresponding to them. Mm-hmm. And so I find neutralism to be a very persuasive point of view. And if that's right, it undercuts the main argument for contemporary Platonism.
Very good.
I think that's right. I mean, I want to join in agreement on that. It does undercut at least a host of arguments for realism. It doesn't undercut my particular reasons for realism. We'll get to those. But before that, I want to just emphasize another point of common ground, which is that I'm not a conceptualist. And actually, I've never been a conceptualist. I was kind of toying with this sort of hybrid view where some of the abstracta depend on reflection, mental reflection, whereas other abstracta is ungrounded. But the view that I've been toying with most recently is what I might call an Aristotelian realism. So the idea here would be that this is actually related, Bill, to something that you said about a viable option for classical theists, which is an option where you don't follow the Platonist ontological assay of things, where you say X is brown in virtue of X having the property of being brown, but rather X is brown and X having the property of being brown. Those two statements are actually just describing the same reality. It's not that X is brown in virtue of this deeper thing. And it's kind of what you might call a lightweight realism. And on this view, my thought is that you could ground properties in particulars. So for example, being me is grounded in me. God's perfection is grounded in God. And this also helps to explain how you could have God having all those positive properties, is because there's this more basic reality that grounds all that positivity. It also gives you the aseity. It allows you to, I think, solve a lot of the problems that you're worried about. So for example, when I was reading your chapter on conceptualism, I was thinking, yeah, that does seem sort of awkward. That does seem, there are a whole bunch of problems there. Like that all of the mathematical thoughts are propositions, there's just this infinity upon infinity, and God has to sort of think all of them. And it starts getting weird. And then you get a reference problem. And so I think most fundamentally for me, it seems like conceptualism just gets it backward. I mean, it seems like if the earth is round, it's not because somebody's thinking that it's round. It's that you think that it's round, and that's true because it is round.
Yeah.
That's like my kind of fundamental objection to the conceptualism.
Yeah, that was a point that I raised against Alvin Planting as construing properties to be God's concepts, and that things are brown because they fall under the concept of being brown. And as you say, Josh, it seems to me that stands it on its head. The reason it falls under the concept of being brown is because it is brown.
Yes.
So
that just seems right to me. Yeah.
So the view you're talking about, I take it, is this sort of view close to Peter Van Inwagen's, where he rejects that things are metaphysically composed. They don't have these properties as ontological constituents, even though these do exist. And so he's able to avoid the problem that a thing would need to have properties in order to create properties.
Yeah, there's a couple views here. There's the constituent ontology versus a relational ontology. So the constituent ontology, as you just said, to have a property is to contain it as some kind of constituent. So you're right, Peter does reject that. And then there's this other thesis of explanation that, so that the object is brown in virtue of having sort of standing in the exemplification relation to brownness. And Peter rejects both of those. And I would definitely reject the explanation requirement. As for the constituent ontology, I wrote a paper for Michael Lux when I was at Notre Dame defending the constituent ontology.
Okay.
But at the end, I'm not really sure. Probably I would do without it. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question about that. One of the classical objections to Aristotelian view is the problem of uninstantiated properties. We can understand how the property of felinity would exist because God has created cats. But what about the property of unicornality or the property of felinity during the Jurassic period when there weren't any cats? It seems like there should be a property, but how could it exist if the particulars don't exist?
Yeah. So my thought about that is that there are concepts and that you get concepts from atomic properties. So for example, if I see a red object, I experience its redness, and that gives me the concept of red. Then I could see a blue object, I experience its blueness, then that gives me the concept of blue. And then through mental reflection, I can generate the concept of red or blue. And my thought is that that's not like a real property, that's a concept. And the distinction here is relevant to my motivation for not being a conceptualist, which is I think that objects have their properties prior to the reflection. I'm not tempted to think that it has red or blue prior to my reflection, if that makes sense. But I do think it would have red prior to my reflection, but red or blue, that seems like that could be conceptual.
So with respect then to, say, felinity during the Jurassic period, are you saying that while there is at that time no property of felinity, nevertheless there is the concept of felinity in God's mind?
That could be, yes, if God has put that together. So I'm sort of leaving it open, even whether God sort of must immediately conceptualize everything. And so in fact, I thought you might appreciate this because it allows a kind of finitism with respect to abstracta. So you have some basic features grounded in God, and then God could reflect on those features to generate as many abstracta as he'd like.
That's intriguing.
So you've got a potential infinite.
Which I like.
So it seemed to me that your main criticism with respect to this view was that you weren't sure it would be motivated. What would be the reason? But then I also kind of had the feeling that your main worries with realism had to do with the aseity. And so if I can give you aseity, I can give you even your finitism that you like. And this isn't me just trying to give you what you want. I mean, I was sort of independently moved to this by philosophical reflection that was sort of coinciding with your, I think, theological commitments. So I thought you might be interested in I've got 5 reasons for being a realist that I think get around neutralism and all of your objections.
Okay.
And actually, those 5 reasons, I do have them as overlays. So I do want to move to this. But real quick, I did have a question for you, Josh, because when you use the term abstracta, it just makes me think because, and perhaps I can bring up this overlay while I'm asking the question, is under realism, you have things like abstract objects and concrete objects. And so something like divine conceptualism would affirm that there are mental objects and those are concrete objects, but it would not affirm that there are abstract objects, because it does seem that either you have absolute creationism or uncreated, which is Platonism. But I'm wondering if you'd maybe take a different approach where you do believe in abstract objects, but see them as grounded in God's nature. Is that right, or is that not right?
It might be right. It depends if you define how you define abstract. I mean, so one way to define it is just look at paradigm examples, properties, propositions, relations, and then you have the concept of abstract is just like whatever those are, right? Another way is just to say that they are causally effect. They don't have causal impact or causal power. And I guess on either of those definitions, I'm happy to say that the properties are abstract. That's not, I don't really have a dog in that fight so much, but I think that would be the view. So then if you go to the absolute creationism, there's that distinction between creation through grounding versus creation through some kind of mental action or action. I think that's a really important distinction because it does seem very odd to my ears to imagine God like creating his own nature. It's like pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. That doesn't seem right. But I mean, as you point out, Bill, in your book, you can understand that creationism as a kind of grounding relation. In fact, you even kind of interact with Peter Van Wagen on this point and say Peter hasn't really explored this option as much, or at least that wasn't exactly how you put it, but he hadn't really shown why that option should be ruled out.
Right.
When it's a ground.
Peter rejects absolute creationism, though the view that he holds of abstract objects seems to me to mesh nicely with it if he would take that step.
Yeah.
And so the view you're suggesting would fit under that real Platonism.
That's right.
Yeah, so I guess I could bring up the first reason here, Josh, and you could outline it, and then we could have Bill come back on it.
Yeah. So about my reasons, so I sent you these notes. First, just a disclaimer. So these aren't reasons that I'm giving sort of in the spirit of like winning a debate here. This is just me thinking, like, why am I motivated to think that there are properties? And I just listed 5 reasons. And these first 2 reasons aren't really even arguments. The first 2 are just from pointing. So just as I might point to my wife to explain why I think she exists, why I think my wife exists, I like point to her. I would point to colors to tell you why I think colors exist. It seems to me like I can distinguish blue from red. And if blue and red were just nothing, then to distinguish blue from red would be to distinguish nothing from nothing. But I mean, you can't distinguish one nothing from another. Nothing is just nothing. It just seems like I'm just seeing blue. I'm just seeing red. This is not an argument. It's just sort of this sense of acquaintance with properties. And my second argument's related. So I want to just do these together. I say this is the argument from abstract reference. So I have a favorite color. My favorite color is blue. This does relate, Bill, to the argument you mentioned from reference. I do agree that reference doesn't automatically imply existence. I mean, I think that there can be thoughts about fictional characters, and those fictional characters don't thereby really exist. So you have to look at the context to see whether what you're talking about is meant to actually pick up something. And I'm just telling you that blue really is my favorite color. Like I really am referring to blue, and I am just convinced, therefore, that blue is real.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a couple arguments. I guess you can't really respond to those because they're not actually arguments. They're just...
I can say by way of response that my experience is very different. I don't see properties. When I look out at the world, I see a brown dog, I see a big elephant, I see a green tree, but I don't see greenness or bigness or brownness. I've never understood people who say that they see properties. And this applies even more clearly, I think, to mathematical objects. I don't see sets. I don't think anybody perceives sets. So I guess my experience is just real different. And similarly, my wife has a favorite number. She likes the number 8. But the fact that Jen has a favorite number, to say that commits her or somebody who believes that to the reality of the number 8 just seems to me to be ontologically inflationary. We can talk about her favorite number or your favorite color, I think, without believing that there's a mind-independent object or thing out there that is the referent of these words.
I wondered if maybe your worry, I don't think this is all of the worry, but I wondered if maybe your worry is that you're thinking of existence in a kind of heavyweight way, a kind of sort of fundamental existence in the Platonist way, right? But what if we think of it sort of in a lightweight way, so that it's not a fundamental thing? When I see 2 blue cups, let's say one cup is blue and the other is red. They're similar in every other respect. And I see that there is something different between them. And I say it's blue. And you say, oh, well, that doesn't commit you to believing in this sort of abstract property. It's like, well, okay, well, once you start saying that, it sort of leads the mind into the land of definition, and maybe you're committing yourself to more than you mean. But I don't mean something so meaty, so substantial, if that makes sense. I just mean something lightweight.
You remember in the book, I talk about the difference between lightweight Platonism and heavyweight Platonism. Some of the most ardent defenders of Platonism on the scene today, like John Burgess and Gideon Rosen and Michael Dummett and others, are lightweight Platonists. They have, as you say, a very thin notion of existence. And in that very lightweight sense, of course, I'd be happy to say that these things exist and that there are odd numbers, for example. How can anybody deny there are odd numbers? Sure. But what I want to resist is that this commits you to heavyweight ontological commitments. But I'm very happy to affirm a lightweight Platonism. It seems to me that view almost borders on a view I talk about later in the book, a kind of anti-realism called neo-Meinongianism, according to which there are non-existent objects. And these lightweight Platonists seem very close to this kind of neo-Meinongianism. But yeah, I don't have any problem, Josh, with this kind of lightweight existence claims.
Yeah, and I want to say it's an Aristotelian view, so that we are not worried about the ungrounded nature of these things. And that, again, is because I want to explain things as far as I can. I mean, I think this is this makes sense. And so, well, let me move on to my other arguments. Now I actually do have arguments. All of them, I'm tempted to say they all have this sort of flat-footed feeling to them, I guess because they're just confessions of things, but they do, I think, serve to clarify some of the things that are at stake here. So argument number 3 is from truth. So premise 1, if truth were not real, nothing would be true. Now I can already tell you're going to have an objection to premise 1, but hold on to that. Number 2, some things are true, therefore truth is real. And so I have in my notes, I agree with Craig that one's ontological commitment isn't just a matter of regimenting language in a certain way. So there is a P such that P equals a property is no more or less ontologically committing than something has a property. So I agree that it's not just a matter of the syntax of the language that you sort of read out your ontological commitments. So compare an example. This table has a part. I would say this sentence, this table has a part, is no more or less ontologically committing than there is a part that this table has. So in the second case, I use this sort of Quinean meta-ontology of quantifying over the part, whereas in the first case, I didn't. I just said this table has a part. And I actually agree with you, Bill, that those are sort of equally ontologically committing or equally not ontologically committing. So that would be a kind of neutralism. And so I agree that the context, and I'd also say the intention, is going to be relevant, not just the syntax. So going back to my first premise, if truth were not real, nothing would be true. I guess I'm sort of thinking of that as like saying the table has a part. If I say the table has a part in this context, I think the part is real. It's not, do you know what I mean? Like, so in the same way, I think there are things that have truth. And so I think that truth is real. Now there is not a parthood relation. This is hard because I'm really at the ground level. It's like I'm just confessing that it just looks like things have properties. I was actually talking with my 11-year-old about the topic, and, because he helps me, he teaches me. I've become corrupted by distinctions in philosophy, and he brings me back to this sort of innocent acquaintance with normal common sense. And he told me, I was like, so Micah, like, do you think something could have properties even if there aren't properties? And he said that was just a craziness. And so according to the 11-year-old's intuition, something has properties seems to imply that there are properties. Now, I agree, there are isn't necessarily ontologically committing, But now I'm sort of getting lost as to what ontological committing means, especially if we allow this sort of lightweight there are.
Exactly.
To be open to.
Yeah, it seemed to me that, Josh, in this premise, for it to be plausible, the concept of reality has to be very lightweight, very thin, analogous to what you said about the parts of something, especially what are sometimes called arbitrary, undetached parts, like, say, my left side. We can talk about my left side, but I don't think there's an object that exists as my left side. There's just me. And similarly, with regard to truth, sure, truth can be real in this very lightweight sense, but we shouldn't therefore think that truth is an object, that it's a thing that is out there in the world in this sort of mind-dependent way. So again, I think that we're plausibly dealing with very lightweight concepts of what is real.
What if it were not a concept, but also lightweight? So think of, let's say, God's perfection, the idea, or let's say God's knowledge, that this knowledge, let's say, is a property of God. It's lightweight. It's not an object. It is awkward to, I talk with my friends who aren't philosophers. What do you think about abstract objects? That's a category mistake. It's not an object. Objects are like meaty, Oh. But I know that when we use that language, because I'm sort of worried the language can sort of trip us up into saying things that we don't really mean. If I say that God has knowledge and that that's a property of God, and if we say that that's lightweight, it doesn't have to be an object. It doesn't have to be out there in that sense, but doesn't also have to be a concept either. It's sort of prior to conceptual reflection. I wonder if you might actually be kind of happy with this sort of lightweight Aristotelian realism.
Oh, I think so. I think I would. I mean, in the kind of Aristotelian medieval tradition, at least, things like properties were thought to be abstract in the sense that the mind abstracts them from the particulars. That you take the brown dog and you subtract from it all of its other features than the color, and that which is left over then is the property of being brown. That's just a mental abstraction. And I'm perfectly all right with that kind of Aristotelianism, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just hope that I can allow the properties, at least some of them, to exist prior to concepts, but then still allow for mental abstractions. So that, like, disjunctives, like red or blue, would be a concept, for example. Yeah, so I wonder if I could just continue through the arguments, because I think that what these do is help to clarify the concept. So argument number 4, if you want to put that one on the screen. Argument number 5 will be probably the most interesting one. But so this just kind of builds from the other argument. Maybe you didn't like the premise that I gave before, that just because some things are true, that therefore there is truth. So let's not use that premise. Instead, let's just say some things are true. Whatever is true exists. This is what is sometimes called serious actualism. Something can't have features if there isn't that thing to have those features. Therefore, true things exist. And my thought, actually, Bill, was that you might accept this conclusion and then just say that true things are concrete. Is that right? Does that seem right?
Yes, I think I would say that sentences are true and that those are concrete. So, yeah, there are some things that are true. I think that's right. But what I would resist would be the idea that there are abstract objects like propositions that have truth values.
So let me try this. So sentences, I would think, aren't primary bearers of truth. So for example, you could have 2 sentences in different languages, but they mean the same thing. And the idea here is that what they mean would be the primary bearer of truth. So when I say some things are true, I'm referring to the primary bearers of truth.
Yeah.
And so these could be thoughts, perhaps. So therefore, thoughts exist. And maybe you would be okay with that, and then you might think thoughts are concrete. Does that seem
Yeah, that's fine too. I'm happy to say that a person's thoughts have a truth value, are true or false, and that God has thoughts. Well, in one sense, maybe that's true. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I'm more inclined to a kind of simple view of divine cognition that wouldn't break it up into thoughts. But
yeah,
I think that your thought that you are on this program is true.
Yeah, and so then our thoughts can also seem to share something in common, sort of the content of the thought. And maybe that's what I want to call the proposition, without committing myself to sort of the whole Platonist view of propositions. And so, we might be close here. I wrote down in my notes that I don't really have a dog in the fight over whether these things are concrete or abstract. The things that are sort of the contents of our thoughts that are shared, I'm inclined to think that they're abstract in the sense that they don't have causal powers of their own. But nothing deep seems to turn on that.
Without wanting to lead our conversation too far astray, I do find myself very attracted to a deflationary view of truth, according to which the truth predicate is not really a substantive property. The truth predicate is just a device for semantic assent, a way of talking about something rather than asserting it. So rather than assert that Hitler was a bad man, I can ascend semantically and say, it is true that Hitler was a bad man. And now I'm making a quite different assertion. And I can descend semantically as well from any statement like it is true that P to just asserting P. So I'm not convinced that truth is really a substantive property rather than just a kind of semantic device that is very useful for what are called blind truth ascriptions, where we don't know the propositions to be able to assert them. For example, everything in the classified documents is true. We need a blind truth ascription there because we can't assert all those things. We don't know them, or there are too many, like all of the theorems of piano arithmetic are true. You can't assert them all. There's an infinite number of them. So you have these truth ascriptions that are very useful, but it's just basically a semantic device and not really a substantial predicate. I find that a very attractive view of truth.
I'm curious, Bill, if this kind of takes us to that circularity problem or the getting the order wrong that we had with conceptualism, right? So like if you say that something is brown, you apply the concept to it or you ascribe brownness to it, it seems like, well, what would make that actually apply to the thing is that it is brown.
Yeah.
Sort of in the same way, I guess I kind of have that worry that if you're going to ascribe truth to something, like that's not what makes it true. It's that there's some prior truth. So you could correctly ascribe truth or incorrectly ascribe truth. Like what makes it true in that case?
And that opens up a whole new can of worms about truth maker theory and truth maker maximalism. Do you have to have truth makers for all truths? And probably we don't need to go there today.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a complex area. I do have a book on truth, defending the correspondence theory of truth.
Okay.
So some people might be interested in that. And that's where I do my theory of propositions and truth and correspondence and truth maker maximalism and all that stuff. Although I have to revise my views now because in those days when I wrote that book, I was a Platonist, but now I'm more of an Aristotelian realist.
Do you remember when you were a student at Notre Dame and we first corresponded about this?
That's right.
I remember those emails very well.
I do. I remember I invited you to a debate on Platonism, and I was very confident, and then you were very polite and gentle, and you had some interesting questions. We went back and forth a little bit. I remember that.
Challenging.
So perhaps you'd like to move to this last argument.
The last argument. Okay, this is perhaps the most interesting And I call this the easy argument or the flat-footed argument. This is my way of saying that, you know, you might not be impressed by this argument, but hey, it convinces me. So, all right, so premise one, oh yeah, you have it on the screen there. There are some features Craig and I have in common, like being people, being curious, trying to get to the truth. Therefore, there are some features by adjective dropping. So you just drop the that we have in common. If there are some features, then there really are some features. And this is in Bill's way of saying there really are, you know, ontologically committing way. Therefore, there really are some features. And so that's the argument. And then you want to know about premise three. You know, why do I think that's true? Let me just come back to my notes here. Okay, so I say that my motivation for three is personal. I just don't see what else there really are could mean in this context other than there are. So therefore, I take there really are features to mean the same thing as there are features in this context, and therefore three is a logical truth of the form if A, then A. It's basically saying if there are some features, then there are some features. Because there really are just semantically the same. Now, I don't expect that to convince somebody who thinks perhaps they're different. And let me just be very clear that I don't think this argument generalizes. So here's the same argument form that I don't think works. So premise one, there are some fictional characters I like. Therefore, there are some fictional characters. If there are some fictional characters, then there really are some fictional characters. Therefore, there really are some fictional characters. In the ontologically committing way, like, you know, Spider-Man is like really there, out there in a mind-independent way, as Bill would say. Okay, so I don't think that argument works, even though it's exactly parallel. And so you would be right to challenge somebody who says if the one argument works, but not the other, in virtue of some sort of more general principle that should apply equally to both. I think this is where the neutralist comes in and helps us to
exactly
make that distinction. And so here's the difference. I think that premise one in the second argument that there are some fictional characters, I think what that actually translates to is something like this. And we can debate translations, but something like there are false stories that describe character profiles, attach names to them. And I feel positively towards some of those character profiles when I imagine those characters. Here, the imagination has a kind of aboutness, where aboutness isn't existence entailing. So I have a translation that allows me to exchange talk of concrete characters, real characters, mind-independent characters, for talk of abstract profiles. And I have an article called About Aboutness, where I develop this theory of aboutness so that you can actually have propositions or thoughts or stories that are about things, even if those things don't actually exist in a concrete way. And so I have a translation here, okay? I can translate the argument. I think that's what makes it different. But I don't have a translation with respect to my talk of some of the features that Bill and I have in common. I'm not talking about fictional features that we have in common. I'm talking about real features that I think we have in common. And that's all I have. I mean, it's just, it's almost like we're at rock bottom. I just think we really have features in common. They're real. They're not out there as Platonic, ungrounded entities in this sort of meaty way. They maybe have a thin existence grounded in the particulars, but they're real.
Well, this is another version of the argument that I shared earlier from Van Inwagen about spiders and insects. There are features that spiders and insects share, therefore there are features, and features are properties, and therefore there are properties. And again, my skepticism about that is rooted in my neutralism with respect to the existential quantifier there is. Now, Neo-Quinians will say that you can avoid the ontological commitments of saying there is if you can provide a paraphrase, such as Josh has done for fictional characters, to try to avoid commitment to those characters. And a number of things could be said about that. there's no guarantee that in English we should be able to find such paraphrases to avoid unwanted ontological commitments. Van Inwagen would reject, I'm sure, your paraphrase for fictional characters because he believes that they can't be paraphrased away and that therefore you're stuck with them. And I want to say that your ontology shouldn't depend upon your ingenuity and being able to find in English an acceptable paraphrase. I just am very skeptical that your metaphysical commitment should hang on something like your ability to come up with these ingenious paraphrases.
I might be with you on that. I think that what I'm curious about here is how you would then give the context in which you think that things exist. So imagine you argue that God exists, and then your interlocutor says, you know what, I actually agree with all your arguments, and I agree with the conclusion that God exists, but God doesn't really exist. That's not ontologically committing. Neutralism is true. And somehow you have a way through the context to specify that you really mean that it exists. And I think that's all I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to point to a context where it looks like there really are some things. And then if somebody says, well, okay, I accept your argument for the conclusion that there really are some things, but why I think that there really are some things, it's almost like I actually want to hear them translate there are first before I can even understand how they're not inviting me into a contradiction.
Yes, I mean, you're raising here a very difficult question about what it means to exist and how do we cash that out in terms of heavyweight existence claims. I think the best I can do so far on this would be to say that since I don't believe that abstract objects exist, I would be inclined to say that to exist means to be a concrete object.
Yeah, and is that
that's what I mean. Or something exists, that it's a concrete object.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you mean by the word exists. Exists concrete.
Well, I mean, in one sense, it's a primitive term that maybe you can't give a meaning to, but that would maybe explicate it, that something exists if and only if it is a concrete object. So I toyed with calling this view concretism, but I don't want my skepticism about Platonism to stand or fall on my positive ability to characterize metaphysically heavyweight existence. And so I'm not staking a claim here, I mean to say.
Yeah, and then by concrete, would you say that means like has causal powers?
Yes, exactly, has causal efficacy or causal powers.
Yeah.
Right, and so you would explicate it in those terms.
Right.
And that would give a really nice concept of existence, I think.
Well, it's interesting because then our views might even come more into alignment, because I'm not claiming that the colors or the properties that we share in common have kind of their own causal powers.
Right.
I'm saying they are a kind of lightweight thing.
Yeah.
So we don't really disagree then about whether they exist in this concrete way.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, an interesting fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we are coming to the end of the episode here, I did want to ask Dr. Craig, and since we've had 5 arguments for realism, perhaps if you had an argument for neutralism, because some people, if we talk about, for example, the argument for mathematics that you've been discussing a lot lately, and these kinds of things, if someone says, well, if mathematical objects don't really exist, how can we even talk about the efficacy of mathematics in our universe and how we can have truths like there is one God or there are 3 persons of the Trinity if there is no such thing as mathematical objects? So I guess how would you argue for neutralism in that sense where the mathematical truths are grounded but maybe don't have a concrete or abstract existence?
Well, I think that the best arguments for neutralism would be arguments based upon ordinary language. Mm-hmm. It is so easy to show that in ordinary language, informal quantifiers like there is and there are or some as well as existence claims, are lightweight and ontologically neutral. We say things like, Sherry's disappointment with her husband was profound, or there are deep differences between Republicans and Democrats, or the weather in Atlanta will be hot today. And I don't think any of us want to be ontologically committed to saying there are objects in the world like weather or differences or disappointments, some of which are deep. So I think ordinary language just belies the idea that the use of these quantifiers in singular terms is ontologically committing. And the reflex argument of that would be to say that if you do take them to be ontologically committing, then it is outrageously ontologically inflationary. It will commit you to things like Donald Duck and other fictional characters, as well as numbers and propositions and properties and sets and all sorts of things in ordinary language, things like wholes, for example, and lacks, because we refer to them and quantify over them. And so if we do assume this heavyweight criterion of ontological commitment, it's going to be very ontologically inflationary, I think.
And then what would be your argument for how God stands as the ground for mathematical truths? Like there are three persons in the Trinity, there is one God.
Well, I think that they're ontologically neutral, that you can affirm truths like that without the singular terms in them referring to objects. So in the same way that I can assert the weather in Atlanta will be hot today, or Sherry's disappointment with her husband was profound, without committing you to objects, things in the world, like weather and disappointments. So I can say 2 + 2 = 4 without being committed ontologically to something called 2 + 2 or 4. Once you hold to the view that singular terms are not ontologically committing, then there's just no problem in asserting these mathematical truths.
And then, Josh, in a minute, I do want to ask you to come back on that. But John Dunphy, you came in here late because your computer was malfunctioning. I apologize. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and questions from this fruitful discussion between Dr. Craig and Dr. Josh. So whenever I have dreams, like I remember them like they're memories of my own whenever I wake up, and it's almost like they have their own ontological status. And like, as Josh was saying, Spider-Man was actually in my dream where, I met Darth Vader and we fought or whatnot and had a lightsaber fight. And it's just like, that almost inclines me towards realism, because it's just like, if that was so real, then clearly I'm not saying I'm a realist because I don't know enough, but like, it just makes me more inclined towards realism. And that would be like some sort of argument from intuition. What would be your thoughts on that, Dr. Craig?
Oh, dream figures are one of the prime examples used by the neutralist philosopher Jody Azuni to show that these are not ontologically committing. You can say things like, I've dreamt about the same woman 3 nights in a row now, without being ontologically committed to some object that is, the same 3 nights in a row in your dreams. So dreams are very much like fictional characters. They would be prime examples of things to which we can refer and quantify over, even though they don't exist.
If I could just chime in, I'm sort of sympathetic with the idea that, how can you distinguish one dream from another if there's nothing you're aware of that's different from the one dream and the other dream? If there's nothing, and so then I think, well, what would I be aware of? Well, property profiles, features, characters, which are sets of properties. But I hasten to add here that these aren't, they don't exist in Bill's sense of having that meaty, concrete, causal power existence, right? So they're still lightweight. And I also actually want to really affirm what Bill was saying about the neutralists. I think that's absolutely right, that your singular terms don't automatically commit you to what they're about. First, there could be a translation, so you could swap them out with a translation. And if there's not a translation, then in that case, if there really isn't a translation, then I mean, it's hard for me to see what I'm actually saying if I'm not saying that they're there, at least in a lightweight way. I'm not committed to the heavyweight ontological, causally powerful things, but I think that dream objects do seem to kind of point their way towards at least some kind of lightweight distinctions between properties in those dreams. But all that to say, I really want to emphasize that I'm not arguing against here. I mean, I think the neutralist insight is very valuable. It's an important one, and I think it does invite the person who's arguing for realism to say more. They can't just, this is, I really want to emphasize this, and I thought Craig's discussion of this in his book was masterful. I mean, he goes through all of these sentences that seem to be true, but clearly aren't referring to things. And so it would be a mistake, I think, to just assume, just reading off your language, oh, it says there are, therefore those things really are there. I think that would be a mistake, and I think that's an important insight there. So I really want to emphasize that. I'm not objecting to neutralism here.
Well, that's amazing. And I do have one last question that it's kind of off topic, but not so much in the sense of divine insight. It's just because, Dr. Craig, since I have you here, I can't pass up the opportunity to ask you it. And in fact, I asked Josh this question before because it's something that just all of a sudden struck me one day as I was thinking of the ontological argument, how God is a necessary being and these things. And it all of a sudden struck me, well, what is necessary about the number 3 in the sense that not that it exists, but that there are 3 persons? Why is it necessary? Like, I can understand it's necessary that God have a perfect nature, or it's necessary that he be omniscient. But why is it necessary that there not be 4 persons in the Trinity, or not in the Trinity, but why there not be 4 persons in the Godhead, or not be 2 persons in the Godhead? And I didn't know if you had an answer to that question.
I don't. I know Richard Swinburne has given arguments as to why there have to be exactly 3 persons in the Trinity, but I didn't find it persuasive. For me, that sort of fact doesn't need an explanation. There can be metaphysically necessary truths about God, which are just ultimate and don't have any further explanation. Josh, do you have a reason as to why there are exactly 3 persons in the Trinity?
So this is interesting because, I mean, I want to explain things as far as I can. I mean, this was one of my motivations for getting off of the Platonism, was that it seemed to have these necessities that have no further explanation. I mean, I'm not sure if I quite understood what you're saying there, Bill. Were you saying that there are metaphysical necessities that have no further explanation?
Yes, like that God is 3 persons. I mean, do you have an explanation as to why God is tripersonal? That's just the way God is.
I've sort of toyed. I have different thoughts on this. So one model is that there's something about cooperative love that's categorically different than just one person loving another, and that sort of the maximal being would have this kind of maximal quality of cooperative love, and then there's sort of no further reason to require more. What I mean is, if you have 4 or 5 or 6 persons, that's still cooperative love, so it doesn't add a new category. That's something that I've thought about, but I think the thing that seems to strike me the most is that there's an advantage of having an explanation, if you can have one. Having all of the necessities explained in a sort of single root. Again, I mean, this is why I moved off of Platonism, is that it seemed to multiply ungrounded necessities. And so it seemed like, okay, well, the Aristotelian realism gives me the grounds for that. And then with respect to God's personality or properties, or let's say personalities, I would like it if all of that could be grounded in something more basic, perhaps just grounded in God somehow. And if it can't, then in my view, that would be a cost of my view. Does that make sense? That kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, it seems to me that what would be desirable would be to show why 3 persons is in some way more perfect than being two persons or four or more persons. And therefore, in virtue of being the greatest conceivable being, God would be exactly three persons. But while I do think we can give arguments as to why there needs to be a plurality of persons in God, I haven't seen a good one yet for why it has to be exactly three rather than two.
What do you think about that sort of plurality of the cooperative?
Well, I like the cooperative thing, but can't you have just two people cooperating, two persons?
They're cooperating in that binary way, but they're not cooperating to love, if that makes sense. They're not cooperating to love another.
Oh, I see.
You see what I mean? Like when my wife and I began to have children, it seemed like there was this new kind of love that we experienced.
Okay, well, that's an angle I hadn't thought of. I understand now what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, also, I think that's a great way to come to a close. I highly recommend everybody get this book. This is the kind of stuff that really gets my gears grinding. Books like this and Time and Eternity, these very deep philosophical things. So the YouTube channel, Dr. Craig videos, of course, reasonablefaith.org. There's a Reasonable Faith Facebook page. Dr. Craig, is there any other places people can go to look for you?
Well, our Dr. Craig videos and also the Reasonable Faith videos on YouTube are our two channels. And then videos are posted on the Facebook page. And you can also go to the website, reasonablefaith.org.
Awesome. And Josh's YouTube channel is Worldview Design. Josh, I am drawing a blank on your website.
JoshuaLRasmussen.com. And I've got free resources there and articles that people can access. Yeah.
Awesome. So I just want to thank you both so much for taking the time out. This has been one of my favorite episodes. And just to end on a quick fun note, John, I know you did say you had the toughest question William Lane Craig would ever have to answer.
Yeah, if everything needs a cause, then what caused God?
Yeah, I don't.
And don't you know you're an atheist to 3,000 other gods? I mean, clearly debunked.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that everything that exists has or needs a cause, obviously. I just want to say in closing that I am so grateful for Josh Rasmussen and the way he represents the younger generation of Christian philosophers that are coming up and will be taking the place of the older generation now that is fading from the scene. And it's exciting to see young philosophers like Josh in the ascendancy.
Yeah, and of course,
I appreciate that. I mean, this is just such a treat for me, such an honor. I was just thinking before our time together, I was telling my wife, like, wow, I remember going to college, like as a freshman, and discovering your debates and your articles online. And they were all very technical and sophisticated. I didn't understand what I was reading. And then now here I am having this nice, fun conversation with you. This is just kind of surreal. So I really appreciate that.
Good.
Yeah, again, thank you both so much. And also Josh's book, How Reason Can Lead to God, also an excellent book. Dr. Craig's new book, The Atonement and Death of Christ. Amazing stuff. I have not finished it yet, but I look forward to it. Once again, thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here.
Thank you.
Great to be with
It's been fun.